So now here's kind of another piece of advice question.
Mhm.
Um, we're talking about working in software and producing music. What advice would you have for someone who is just starting to use plugins? Maybe they are just playing with reverb, or they're playing with different kinds of plugins and things. Do you have any tips or things that can make that go better for someone?
Sure. And this goes back to the language comment. There's really a couple words you're going to need to know. And if you're listening, write this down: dry, wet,
Yep.
decay time,
Mm-hmm.
ratio, threshold, makeup gain. Honestly, if you can get those words down and be able to look at any plugin and to be able to reference those words on basically almost every type of plugin, uh, then that's going to be a really good start for you.
Yep. No, I think that's a really good
Yeah.
piece of advice. And I, what, just to kind of piggyback on that, I might also just say, kind of what we were talking about before, just open the plugin, just throw it on there and see what it's doing.
Yep.
See how it's changing the sound. Play with those settings and
Change every knob.
see
Yeah.
what yeah, and see what you like, because that's one of those things that I think sometimes, and we'll get into this just in a bit, but sometimes, for example, like compression, people are so intimidated by it, and it's just like, one of the things that was really eye opening for me was when I learned from Trina Shoemaker, down in New Orleans, and she's like, I am not. She's like, I'm not classically. I didn't go to school for engineering, so I couldn't tell you exactly how all of this compressor functions and all that stuff. All she knows is that she's like, oh, I kind of want to compress this guitar a little bit or whatever, and she'll just throw it on there and just start playing with ratios and playing with the settings. And she's like, yeah, I like how that sounded cool. So I think take that. If you're just starting, that's someone who has been doing this for decades, and here's Ben, saying the same thing, and me as well. Just throw it on there, because really what it is it's what sounds good, and these are
Yeah.
just tools
Right.
that can
Yeah.
help you.
Exactly. There are rules, and there are some finite rules,
Sure.
but for the most part, there kind of aren't. Um,
Yeah.
barring like, well, yeah, there's kind of no rules. I mean, it's very loose. I mean, obviously, with distortion and gain structure and over compression and things like that, you do want to
Right.
be, working with the playing field that is out there, which goes back to the originality kind of comment I made. But yeah, try stuff, move things around, and don't be hard on yourself. I mean, I listen to old productions that I have made that I thought sounded really great at the time, and honestly, people still think they sound great, and I'm like, holy shit, I overcompressed the hell out of that track. Why did I do that? If I was gonna mix it now, I would do it totally different.
Yep. I had the same thing. I've looked at some of the old things I've done, and I'm like, man, this just sounds like some cheesy 80s video game or something. Like,
Exactly.
and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I guess that,
Yeah.
whatever. When at
Yeah.
the time I'm like, this is all right. This is my Grammy right here.
Yeah. People
uh,
people used to give me the nickname Gain Crusher Runyon because I would just over compress everything. They'd be like, "Yeah, man, you slap that 40-1 right on it and just crush it, and it's good to go." Yeah.
right on. So, kind of related to plugins, and I think this is also really key for music production, and it's something that I still kind of work on myself. Do you have any advice for people starting to use loops or create their own loops? Just there's all sorts of. I feel like some people there's just misinformation about
Mhm.
loops, or people just don't understand.
Sure.
Um, so do you have any advice or tips for people to do it well?
Well, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
On one hand, there's a school of thought that says that's cheap or that's cheating or whatever. Um, you
Oh
know,
yeah. I
on
don't
the
subscribe to that myself.
I don't know. I generally don't either. On the other hand, I think "Love in This Club" from Usher literally uses a GarageBand loop. So,
Right.
who's to say? Um, I gonna go back to my comment about that service called Splice.
Mm-hmm.
What's super awesome about it is that, generally speaking, before I would have to use a loop as a starting point because that way I could build around it with MIDI. If I had already had a track going, finding a musical loop to fit to it would assume that I knew the key and scale, which I didn't necessarily based on my lack of knowledge. Um,
Right.
so that's going to be tough for introduction producers. However, with services like Splice, you can search and filter by key and scale and BPM so that you can fit in loops into your arrangements that have already been made. And then, obviously be aware of the pitch shifting functions in your DAW of choice. Because maybe you might find a loop and you're like, wow, this sounds really good, but it's not in the same key. And, if it's somehow in the right scale, you might be able to pitch it down a couple semitones or 5 or 6 semitones and
And get there.
get it in there. And I had that on one of these tracks, which has this perfect guitar loop I heard. And I was like, I have to find a way to fit this in to the track. And I did. And then even on top of that, if there's one or two notes that are sour, but it's almost working, again, with the pitch shifting stuff, be aware with things like a flex pitch in Logic or being able to transpose individual sections in Ableton, and maybe you can move one of those notes into the progression.